The Federal Reserve has long taken a traditional approach to monetary policy, but last year it began the journey of understanding the implications of structural racism in America's economy. Fed officials want to advance actions to improve the economic outcomes for all and began a series of talks entitled Racism and the Economy. The most recent panel focused on housing, and one of the contributors are right here. Dr. Bambie Hayes-Brown, CEO of Georgia Advancing Communities Together, joins us. Thank you for being here. Dr. Hayes-Brown, you have more than 24 years of experience in housing, community, and economic development, the last 3 leading Georgia Act. Briefly tell us, what does the organization do?
Yes, good morning. Thank you. Georgia Advancing Communities Together, also known as Georgia ACT, we're a statewide nonprofit affordable housing and community development membership organization. And our mission is to build, support, and inform a statewide network of thriving organizations, professionals, and individuals advancing equitable housing and community development. And our vision is for all Georgia families to have safe and decent housing in vibrant neighborhoods. So in addition to providing technical assistance to our members that are mostly comprised of nonprofit developers, community development corporations, housing counseling agencies, and municipalities, we do policy and advocacy work on the local, state, and federal level around affordable housing and community development.
Now, your work is important because the Fed says so much of this comes down to the fact that housing often dictates access to jobs, health care, food. Now, what concrete things can the Federal Reserve do to ensure more equitable housing? You had quite a few fantastic ideas.
Yes, thank you. I know that the Federal Reserve is, of course, limited to the amount of advocacy things that they can do, but they can also use their influence. And I think that is most important, their influence and their platform for information to get that information and those solutions out there that come forth from those of us who are on the ground, such as advocacy groups and practitioners. So having the convenings, like the series of webinars that they held, and one yesterday having to do with race and equity and how it relates to housing, and bringing forth those ideas. And let's talk through those ideas and look at solutions to better help move the equity needle and sustain truly affordable housing for our residents and our citizens.
You mentioned an idea about training real estate agents from the start. Tell us your idea.
Yes, I do hold a real estate broker's license. And one of the topics that we talked about on yesterday had to do with appraisals. But I see both appraisers, loan officers, and real estate professionals going hand in hand. And it is important that all of those industry professionals complete training, not just your training to get your license and your training for renewal, but to also go deeper into ethics, go deeper into trainings that look at internal racial biases and how to overcome them, and look at standardizing a lot of our objectives. And so those trainings become very important. In addition to actually including practitioners and those people with lived experiences in the training, because oftentimes, and I see this unfortunately in our industry, that there's a not in my backyard attitude, also known as NIMBY, and sometimes that carries out into the work that professionals do. Sometimes it may be unintentional, but sometimes it may be intentional, and we have to be aware of that. So training, as well as if a person violates any code of the fair housing, that we do have those enforcement of those fines and those consequences.
Now, something else interesting you've mentioned, not in the Fed panel, but prior to, assessing the credit worthiness of someone, their ability to pay back. Lenders, you mentioned, can do something a little different. So what are some of, or maybe one of the ideas that you would suggest lenders use to assess credit worthiness?
Yes, unfortunately, it costs a lot to be poor. So if you're poor and you don't have a good credit score, then you pay more money. So we need to look at ways that we can kind of change the tide and change our thoughts about that. Let's look at items such as non-traditional credit. And I know that FHA guidelines look at non-traditional credit and look at doing some things such as manual underwriting. But let's look at a person's rental history. It's easier to finance a $40,000 car than it is to finance a $40,000 home. So let's look at those non-traditional credit. Let's look at the rental history. Let's look at even things such as utilities and how those things have been paid, so that we can really build and show that people can pay a mortgage so that they can be able to get into a home that will help build wealth, especially for people in Black and Brown communities, because most of the wealth building starts through home ownership.
Dr. Hayes Brown, very quickly, President Biden has outlined his plans to help housing equity. He's also hired a new chief economist in HUD. But let us know, how do you read these actions so far? He hired Janelle Jones, the first Black woman to be chief labor economist. How are you reading these actions so far? It's the early days.
Yes, it is very early, and I think it's a great move, and I really appreciate the Biden administration really taking the lead and being forefront with housing and equity. And, we can set policy all day long, but you can't legislate a person, especially as it relates to racism. You can't legislate racism. So we have to pull in all of those people, our public sector, our private sector, to look at the things that are prohibiting families. For example, if a person wants to rent a unit, they require, because the rental stock is low and it is a landlord market, or as we say with home buyers, it is a seller's market now. But if a low-income renter, if they require 3 times the rent, a 700 credit score, security deposit, first month's rent, last month's rent, risk fee, admin fee, annual increases that far outlast the wages that they're making, then we're doing a lot of great work, but it's really not going to move the needle. So we have to pull the private sector and get them to buy into the fact that they do have a social responsibility to our community.
Accountability as well, I would imagine.
Yes, most definitely.
Dr. Bambie Hayes Brown, CEO of Georgia ACT, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.